Before I begin, I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Lemack for inviting me to participate in the 2021 Trouble Begins lectures. My only regret is that I could not present in person. My name is Richard Coronado. I am an English instructor at South Texas College. My presentation, Complementary Genius, the Sardonic Humor of Kurt Vonnegut and Mark Twain, focuses on the influence Twain had on Vonnegut's fiction. I consider these two men kindred spirits, or as Vonnegut would say in his novel Cat's Cradle, they are part of the same chaos. Chaos being the Bokanist term for teens that do God's will without ever discovering what they are doing. The Twain-Vonnegut chaos extends beyond their lifetimes. Twain died in 1910, and Vonnegut was not born until 1922. And the Bokanon God in Cat's Cradle is an invention. Cat's Cradle begins with a simple declaration. Nothing in this book is true. Live by the FOMA that make you brave and kind and healthy and happy. FOMA is then defined as harmless untruths. Even the novel's Bible, called the Books of Bokanon, begins with the warning, don't be a fool, close this book at once, it's nothing but FOMA. FOMA, of course, are lies. Paradoxically, if nothing in Cat's Cradle is true, then everything in the Books of Bokanon must be true. Obviously, Vonnegut is playfully mocking belief while simultaneously advocating a humanist ethic. Cat's Cradle could have been written if Twain's religious skepticism never reached Vonnegut. But would it have been as playful, as humorous, as scathing? Vonnegut acknowledged Twain's influence in his 1979 lecture at the Mark Twain House, saying, I am, of course, a skeptic about the divinity of Christ and a scorner of the notion that there is a God who cares how we are or what we do. I was raised this way, in the midst of what provincial Easterners imagine to be a Bible Belt. I was confirmed in my skepticism by Mark Twain during my formative years, and by some other good people too. In that same lecture, Vonnegut, after quoting a passage from Life on the Mississippi, attributes to Twain a Christian attitude, one that echoes the Beatitudes, concluding, Mark Twain is saying what Christ said in so many ways that he could not help loving anyone in the midst of life. Vonnegut recognizes in Twain his own humanism, a religious sentiment not grounded on myth or superstition, but on kindness and decency. Twain scholars have arrived at similar conclusions. Dixon Wechter writes, although Mark Twain never lost his deep appreciation for the ethics of Christianity, he stoutly refused allegiance to creeds and churches. Philip Foner adds, Twain was deeply interested in the relationship of institutionalized religion to man and society, particularly in reconciling Christian ethics and the social structures of his own day. And William Phipps identifies some areas where the incongruency between faith and practice became apparent to Twain, writing, disturbed by the chasm between the profession and the practice of the faith, Mark Twain strove to close the gap by focusing upon the ethical implications of Christianity, making many European Americans aware for the first time that African Americans and Chinese immigrants were wrongly being treated as inferior. He drew international attention to the despicable treatment of many Jews in Europe as well, and to the exploitation of natives in colonial territories by imperialists who represented some Western governments and churches. In Palm Sunday, a collection of Vonnegut speeches, Vonnegut prefaces the 1979 remarks at the Mark Twain House by saying, I have meditated with Mark Twain's mind. I began doing it when a child. I do it still. Allow me to acknowledge at this point that there is nothing astonishingly new or original in connecting the work of these two men. In his biography of Vonnegut, Charles Shields points out that Twain's influence on Vonnegut has become axiomatic and self-evident among journalists and among whom he terms true believing academics. However, Shields seems bent on bursting the tie that binds, asserting, for example, that Vonnegut's use of time travel in Slaughterhouse-Five owes more to Ambrose Bierce than to Twain, particularly to Bierce's short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which Vonnegut, Shields tells us, considered the greatest American short story. Though Shields spent a few months with Vonnegut before Vonnegut died in 2007, he offers scant evidence to prove a time travel link to Bierce. The best Shields offers is a reference to the sound of a ticking watch in Occurrence, with Vonnegut describing in Slaughterhouse-Five the contradictory idea that time had stopped and that the years would pass when the second hand of his watch would move. Conspicuously absent from the discussion is any reference to a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court that involves actual time travel. Tracing influence is a complicated business, like mapping the genome, only without the scientific rigor. I, of course, admit to other influences. Prominent Vonnegut scholar and true believer Jerome Klinkowitz, in his several books on Vonnegut, often points to Jonathan Swift's influence, and Vonnegut himself affirms as much in interviews. David Ketterer comments on the Swift-Twain-Vonnegut connection in his book, The Science Fiction of Mark Twain, writing, "If Mark Twain is Vonnegut's precursor, Swift deserves credit as a precursor of Mark Twain's science fiction." What can we say about other influences on Vonnegut? Voltaire, Louis Ferdinand Céline, George Bernard Shaw, George Orwell, Bartlett's quotations. In April of 2003, when Vonnegut delivered the annual Clemens Lecture in Harvard, he acknowledged, "I am nearly as indebted to the Irish persons George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde and Jonathan Swift as I am to Mark Twain and Herman Melville." In no way, then, do I set out to dismiss the myriad ways these authors and countless others have influenced the ideas in the 14 novels and many stories Vonnegut wrote. My purpose here is to offer instances that make concrete the axiomatic assumption of Twain's influence, because frankly, I have yet to come across specific examples pointing to that influence. I offer one example here, one that I did not have in mind when I began organizing my thoughts on this subject. I mentioned earlier David Ketterer's book, The Science Fiction of Mark Twain. There, Ketterer connects an image at the end of Twain's Petrified Man, published in the Territorial Enterprise in 1862, where the figure in question is thumbing its nose. Ketterer notes, "There is a virtually exact parallel to this at the conclusion of Cat's Cradle, where the religious leader Bokonon would, through the use of the substance Ice-9, solidify himself in an identical attitude of disrespect. I would take from the ground some of the blue-white poison that makes statues of men, and I would make a statue of myself lying on my back, grinning horribly, and thumbing my nose at you-know-who." Even here, the connection is tenuous, but I would support Ketterer's assertion of the relationship between the two works, and I intend to offer more examples like Ketterer's. My approach will be twofold. First, I will address the personal and professional similarities in the lives of both men. Second, I will provide instances in Vonnegut that may strike us as coincidence, but that can be considered unconscious plagiarism, a phrase Twain used when admitting to stealing the dedication from Oliver Wendell Holmes's book of poems called Songs in Many Keys, an infraction Holmes assured Twain was no crime, and examples that explore the thematic parallels that permeate their work while providing passages of striking similarity. Even if most of what I cover here strikes some of you as nothing more than mere coincidence, and I am the first to concede that some of it probably is, and even if all of it can be dismissed as just that, the value of this discussion remains as it provides an opportunity to engage serious topics and themes central to the work of both writers. And if they are even partly correct in their philosophical determinism, the ideas raised here may yet be productive. Of their personal and professional lives, I will say first that both Twain and Vonnegut arrived at a life of letters indirectly. Neither studied literature academically. Both were seen as outsiders, not readily accepted into the polite circles of the literati, Twain because of his humor and Vonnegut because of his science fiction. Additionally, both writers worked as journalists. Both served in major conflicts, though Twain's service in the Confederate Army was informal and short-lived. Both endured a catalog of suffering. Twain lost his father when he was 11, saw his brother Henry in the hospital before he died from the injuries suffered when the riverboat Pennsylvania exploded, the guilt of which racked Twain for the rest of his life. His son Langdon died of diphtheria before the age of 2. His daughter Susie died in 1896, his wife Olivia in 1904, and his daughter Jean in 1909, a year before his own death. In the case of Vonnegut, his mother committed suicide on Mother's Day when he visited while on leave from the army. He survived the firebombing of Dresden in 1945. He lost his sister Alice to cancer in 1950, and when her husband died days apart, Vonnegut adopted his 4 nephews. And his own son Mark suffered from schizophrenia. In 1979, by the way, when Vonnegut spoke at the Mark Twain House, he shared the fact that he named his son Mark after Twain. The last thing I will say about their anguished lives is that the suffering took its toll. Vonnegut attempted suicide in 1984 by taking sleeping pills, the same method his mother used. And Twain is reputed to have contemplated suicide in 1866 at the age of 31. Obviously, these men are products of their experiences, and those experiences shape the course of their lives and the direction of their art. Before looking at the examples from the literature, however, I want to point out 2 other significant parallels that may help provide insight into their subject matter and their approach to it. The first addresses the impact 2 servants had on both writers. At the 2003 Hartford lecture, Vonnegut found occasion to praise Ida Young, a Black cook in Vonnegut's childhood home, saying, "If I may insert an autobiographical note at this point, when I was growing up in Indianapolis during the Great Depression, the sanest, wisest, calmest person in our house was our cook, Ida Young." In a 1987 interview, Vonnegut said of Ida Young, "She was humane and wise and gave me decent moral instruction and was exceedingly nice to me. She was as great an influence on me as anybody. The compassionate, forgiving aspects of my beliefs came from Ida Young." Twain's experience with Mary Ann Court, the family cook in Elmira, as recounted word for word as I heard it in A True Story, confesses an insouciant blindness to the plight, the misery, anguish, and terror of Aunt Rachel. Published in 1874, when Twain was 39 and 10 years before the publication of Huckleberry Finn, A True Story is Rachel's response to Twain's question and follow-up comment. "Aunt Rachel, how is it that you've lived 60 years and never had any trouble? You can't have any trouble. I've never heard you sigh and never seen your eye when there wasn't a laugh in it." A True Story is full of pathos, describing the ripping apart of Court's family at a slave auction. Twain, by this time, would have been well acquainted with the evils of slave culture. Terrell Dempsey's book, Searching for Jim, chronicles how inexorably linked Hannibal, Missouri newspapers were with the slave economy during the years Twain apprenticed for Joseph Arment at the Missouri Courier and for his own brother Orion at the Hannibal Journal, where Twain would on occasion take over during his brother's absence. As Dempsey notes, the newspapers of Sam Clemens' world were curiously consistent on the issue of slavery. They had always been crucial to the maintenance of the institution as a market for slaves, with advertisements and legal notices announcing slave auctions and individual slaves for sale. Beyond their importance to the economics of slavery, newspapers fulfilled another function, similar to that of churches in slave culture. They churned out a constant stream of racist propaganda that perpetuated and supported slavery. Dempsey concludes that it is inevitable Twain set the type for many slave-related items during his apprenticeships. The suffering Twain relates in A True Story is personal and proximate in a way that prior experiences were not. His interaction with Mary Ann Court signals an emphatic turn, if I may call it that, one that would become manifest in his later work. And yet, as Dempsey points out, as late as 1891, in an interview for New York World, Twain continued shaping the narrative of his upbringing in Missouri, omitting certain details. Dempsey notes that Twain had not mentioned a word about his daily interactions with the slaves that belonged to his parents. He did not talk about his daily interactions with the slaves in Hannibal, or mention that he had eaten his meals along slaves when he began his newspaper apprenticeship. He didn't discuss racist stories containing dialect that were a staple of Hannibal newspapers that he not only read, but also set into type. And while admiring the bust of Henry Ward Beecher, Clemens did not mention the direct actions that he and his family took against the abolitionists. The second parallel deals with the public image both men carefully cultivated. Both men were aware of the importance of public relations to a successful career. Vonnegut, in part, learned that from his work as a PR man for General Electric. Though not in public relations himself, Twain employed PR techniques as well. As Professor Stephen Railton points out in his lectures on Twain, Twain hoped to make it rich without writing, to maximize his profits from his books, going so far as to trademark his name and incorporating himself as the Mark Twain Company. Evidence of public relation techniques in action can also be found in A Connecticut Yankee, where Hank outfits Arthur's Knights with sandwich boards advertising persimmon soap, among other things. I raise these points to suggest how difficult it can be to arrive at truths about reasons and motivations for their work, as the private man and the public figure may not always reconcile. What we are left to examine is their work. So let us now turn to the examples. Generally speaking, both writers write about Adam and Eve, about heaven, and both are critical of religion. They both address matters of race, equality, justice, and fairness. They are both concerned with the impact of technology on society. They both compare people to machines, and they both employ humor when discussing mankind's darkest and deepest fears. Before proceeding any further, I would like to note for those of you not familiar with Vonnegut, that Vonnegut often refers to the fictional writer Kilgore Trout in his novels. Trout is often considered Vonnegut's alter ego, but the more I think about how many of the examples below come from Trout's novels and stories, I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps Trout is modeled after Twain, even if Twain's fiction did not appear in smutty magazines, as most of Trout's work does. In Vonnegut's novel Timequake, the Kilgore Trout story, No Laughing Matter, describes the power experienced by a flight crew with an atomic bomb strapped to the bottom of their plane. They felt like the boss god himself. In A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, time-traveling Hank Morgans earns the moniker The Boss after acting in godlike fashion and destroying Merlin's tower with a bolt of lightning. That's a pretty weak example. They both use the word boss. To further point out the flaws in this example, note that in the Trout story, the crew is godlike in its option to be merciful, while Hank predicts he will be the boss of the country almost from the moment he arrives. Remember, some of these examples are only vague similarities. Vonnegut does mention Twain directly in Timequake, calling him the funniest American of his time. He then juxtaposes that distinction with this quote from Twain himself. I have never wanted any released friend of mine restored to life since I reached manhood. This idea that death may be preferable to life is chilling. It's a good thing we don't have suicide parlors, ethical or otherwise, as we do in the Vonnegut story, Welcome to the Monkey House. Would it be fair to say that Vonnegut shares this sentiment? In Timequake, Vonnegut asserts there is proof enough to confirm Kilgore Trout's sentiment that being alive is a crock of shit. In the Bigelow Payne version of Twain's The Mysterious Stranger, Satan helps people out of their miseries by literally putting them out of their miseries. He alters the fate of two characters, Nicholas and Lisa, so that their future potential suffering is avoided. Instead of saving Lisa from drowning as he was destined to do, Nicholas drowns along with her. Satan accomplishes this by making a small alteration to Nicholas's timeline. Nicholas gets out of bed 2 minutes later one morning than he would have otherwise, and consequently arrives at the pond, those 2 minutes delayed, resulting in their mutual drowning. The old chain of events where Nicholas saves Lisa had him living to age 62, but suffering terribly from the day of the rescue because of a cold and fever he caught. For 46 years, Satan tells Theodore, he would lie in his bed, a paralytic log, deaf, dumb, blind, and praying night and day for the blessed relief of death. Lisa's own death saves her from the executioner 9 years hence, after a life of pollution, shame, depravity, and crime. Lisa's mother is denied the body of her child because of an unpaid debt to a carpenter who unceremoniously discards the body in a cattle yard. After, she is so forlorn and distraught that Theodore asks Satan to intervene, and Satan does, preventing her days later from literally turning a corner in a marketplace and having her return the way she came, only to have words with a weaver. She blasphemes, the weaver betrays her, and she is sentenced to the stake 3 days later. That little action of not turning the corner, like Nicholas waking 2 minutes later, set Lisa's mother on an entirely new trajectory, one leading to her doom. The idea that our life is a compilation of capricious incidents and accidents is also at the heart of Vonnegut's novel Hocus Pocus. Eugene Debs Hartke traces his own life's demise to a random event that occurred when he was 18. Having been disqualified for cheating at the Science State Fair in Cleveland, Hartke makes for the exits but is blocked by a lieutenant colonel who asks to speak with him. Hartke recounts, "So I stopped. That was the biggest mistake of my life. There were plenty of other exits, and I should have headed for one of those. Every other exit led to the University of Michigan. Any other exit, in all probability, would have led me to a wife who wouldn't go insane. Any exit would have led to a certain amount of misery, I know, life being what it is, but I don't think it would have led me to Vietnam." If only he had woken up 2 minutes later that morning, like Nicholas, instead of serving in Vietnam, he would have studied history and continued playing music and smoking dope. In the novel, he is awaiting trial for leading a prison break of the mostly African-American prisoners serving time at the New York State Maximum Security Adult Correctional Institution at Athena, across the lake from the college where he used to work. Of Tarkington College, Hartke says, "Accident after accident has made Tarkington what it is today. The two prime movers of the universe are time and luck. Those same authorities, time and luck, govern his own life and the lives of the many other characters, including the prisoners at Athena. The same prime movers help us better understand the fiction of Mark Twain and Kurt Vonnegut." In The Mysterious Stranger, Satan tells Theodore, "If you could see into the future as I can, you would see everything that was going to happen to that creature, for nothing can change the order of its life after the first event has determined it." Satan continues, that is, nothing will change it, because each act unfailingly begets an act that begets another, and so on to the end, and the seer can look forward down the line and see just when each act is to have birth from cradle to grave. Although they are not exact, Satan's concept above should recall for us the Tralfamadorian concept of time and free will in Slaughterhouse-Five. The Tralfamadorians tell Billy, "Earthlings are the great explainers, explaining why this event is structured as it is, telling how other events may be achieved or avoided. I am a Tralfamadorian, seeing all time as you might see a stretch of the Rocky Mountains. All time is all time. It does not change. It does not lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is." Twain and Vonnegut owe much to science in general and to Darwin in particular. Their conclusions that life is determined by antecedent causes outside of man's control derive from the brute, observable, and repeatable facts of experience. Twain's scholar Sherwood Cummings does add that, quote, "Twain's interest in determinism can probably be traced to the Newtonian concept of a mechanical universe, and that if Twain did not read Newton's work when he was a subpilot, he did study the deism of the 18th century when he read Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason." We know, of course, that Vonnegut studied chemistry at Cornell and anthropology at the University of Chicago, and that science and technology feature prominently in his fiction. In a 1973 interview with Playboy magazine, Vonnegut states, "I am not very grateful for Darwin, although I suspect he was right. His ideas make people crueler. Darwinism says to them that people who get sick deserve to be sick, that people who are in trouble must deserve to be in trouble. Vonnegut then offers an analogy from biology, comparing the writer to a specialized cell whose job is to introduce new ideas into society and to respond symbolically to life. He seems to suggest that writers act as mankind's immune system, as well as produce the potential mutations that can keep our survival going. He finishes his thought about writers by saying, "I don't think we're in control of what we do." Which leads me to what I consider Twain's most significant influence on Vonnegut, his essay, What is Man? Published in 1906, the essay is neo-Lockean and dispenses with the notion of free will altogether, arguing that man originates nothing, that every idea we hold comes from without, and man is influenced, to the degree his temperament allows, by the myriad forces around him. Further, just as we do not control our breathing or our heartbeat, we do not control our thoughts or our actions. We are, in fact, machines. Twain identifies three forces at work: heredity, or what he calls temperament, training, and environment. The essay is a dialogue between a young man and an old man. When the young man objects to the idea that he is not the master of his own opinions and accuses the old man of spouting foolishness, the old man counters, "It is quite natural opinion, indeed, an inevitable opinion. You did not create the materials out of which it was formed. They are odds and ends of thoughts, impressions, feelings gathered unconsciously from 1,000 books, 1,000 conversations, and from the streams of thought and feeling which have flowed down into your heart and brain out of the hearts and brains of centuries of ancestors. Personally, you did not create even the smallest microscopic fragment of the materials out of which your opinion is made. And personally, you cannot claim even the slender merit of putting the borrowed materials together. That was done automatically by your mental machinery." The young man asks the old man about Shakespeare, and the old man replies, "Shakespeare created nothing, he correctly observed, and he marvelously painted. He exactly portrayed people whom God had created, but he created none himself. Let us spare him the slander of charging him with trying. Shakespeare could not create, he was a machine, and machines do not create." Machines are programmed to function, and they will function well or ill depending on the quality of their parts and simplicity and clarity of their instructions. And some machines are defective. Who does the programming? According to the Kilgore Trout story, the sisters B36 in Timequake, programming was done socially with nothing but talk, talk, talk. Grown-ups would speak to little booblings favorably about presumably appropriate and desirable feelings and deeds. The brains of the youngsters would respond by growing circuits that made civilized pleasures and behaviors automatic. Earlier, I referenced the Trout story, No Laughing Matter, about the pilots aboard the plane carrying the atomic bomb. Court-martialed for not following orders and for not dropping the bomb as instructed, the pilot said he disobeyed because that is what his mother would have wanted him to do. Programs can be overridden, of course. Eugene Debs Hartke in Hocus Pocus shares no resemblance with the real Eugene Debs, whom Vonnegut is fond of quoting. "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Hartke's life is antithetical, in fact, having gone to West Point and having been trained by the Army and put in a soldier suit and turned into a suicidal, homicidal imbecile in 13 weeks. Hartke admits, "I would have killed Jesus Christ himself or herself or itself or whatever if ordered to do so by a superior officer." In God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, the elite class is ready to deprogram their children who awaken to the plight of the underclass and realize their inherited wealth could provide succor for their suffering. When Stuart Buntline inherits $14 million at the age of 16, his financial interests are managed by Reed McAllister of the law firm McAllister, Robgent, Reed, and McGee. Some years later, when Stewart approaches McAllister with the idea of using his wealth to buy decent food and clothing and housing for the poor and right away, McAllister rejoinders with, I've been through this silly argument with so many young people before. Every year, at least one young man whose affairs we manage comes to our office, wants to give his money away. He has completed his first year at some great university. He has learned of unbelievable suffering around the world. He has learned of the great crimes that are at the root of so many family fortunes. He has had his Christian nose rubbed, often for the very first time, in the Sermon on the Mount. Undergirding McAllister's reasons for doing no such thing is the divide created by wealth. Those with money are important, while those without are like cattle who wander aimlessly. In What is Man, the old man tells the young man, whatsoever a man is due to his make and to the influences brought to bear upon it by his heredities, his habitat, his associations. He is moved, directed, commanded by exterior influences solely. He originates nothing, not even a thought. Vonnegut, with his own training in anthropology, seems to be describing the real processes producing the social disparities in society, accident and luck. In Breakfast of Champions, Vonnegut includes himself among the automata, writing in the preface, what do I myself think of this particular book? I feel lousy about it, but I always feel lousy about my books. I am programmed at 50 to perform childishly, to insult the Star-Spangled Banner, to scrawl pictures of a Nazi flag and an asshole and a lot of other things. What is Man makes a distinction between two agents involved in thinking and acting. There is the moral machinery that has no feelings, no stake in the game, and acts only as a thermometer. It registers the heat and the cold and cares not a farthing about either. What then will decide what action a man will take? Twain argues it is the imperious necessity of securing his own approval in every emergency and at all costs. Twain further argues that man's temperament and training will factor in the decision-making as long as they serve the real master, self-approbation. Nothing can be done concerning temperament and heredity, but training leaves room for hope. The premise of Breakfast of Champions revolves around the idea that literature can prove a powerful influence on human behavior. The catalyst of Dwayne Hoover's breakdown is the Kilgore-Trout novel, Now It Can Be Told, which tells Dwayne that of all the creatures in the universe, only Dwayne was thinking and feeling and worrying and planning and so on. Nobody else had any choice to make. Everybody else was a fully automatic machine whose purpose was to stimulate Dwayne. Dwayne was a new type of creature being tested by the creator of the universe. Only Dwayne had free will. Dwayne, suffering from a combination of bad chemicals and bad ideas, goes on a violent spree, attacking anyone who comes near. If bad ideas result in bad consequences, the converse should hold true. Reading Huckleberry Finn and agreeing with Huck that saving Jim was worth forfeiting heaven may have benefited the social justice efforts of the time. What is Man can then act as a practical guide for human behavior. If we apply what it teaches, that man can only act in ways that serve his own interests, then a strategy can be developed to engage behaviors that are communal. Keep in mind that although a mean egoism is at the core of the old man's views, Twain and Vonnegut do not subscribe to the philosophy of ethical egoism, where self-interest will somehow result in a fair and just society. The idea, as with the Sisters B36, is to program minds so that what feels right and true and self-serving results from behaving well with others. In Breakfast of Champions, the creator of the universe creates the entire cosmos, not for Dwayne Hoover per se, but for the reader, which is capitalized Y-O-U. The Kilgore-Trout novel, Now It Can Be Told, catalogs behaviors Vonnegut considered routine enough to restrict the American everyman's possibilities. Your parents were fighting machines and self-pitying machines. Your mother was programmed to bawl out your father for being a defective money-making machine, and your father was programmed to bawl her out for being a defective housekeeping machine. They were programmed to bawl each other out for being defective loving machines. Then your father was programmed to stomp out of the house and slam the door. This automatically turned your mother into a weeping machine. and your father would go down to a tavern where he would get drunk with some other drinking machines. Then all the drinking machines would go to a whorehouse and rent fucking machines. And then your father would drag himself home to become an apologizing machine, and your mother would become a very slow forgiving machine. What matters here is not the husband or the mother, but the child, the YOU being addressed. The behaviors of the parents are the programming and training Twain and Vonnegut insist will shape a person. The young man asks the old man, a conscience can be trained to shun evil and prefer good. The old man answers in the affirmative, but again, only when doing so is beneficial to the self. Winning the approval of others or fearing their disfavor are harmless ways people can be influenced to act in ways that benefit themselves and others. It is worth noting how difficult this enterprise can be even among the cultivated members of a society. Our founding fathers, for instance, they themselves fell short of their own ideals, which Vonnegut makes clear in Breakfast of Champions. A subtitle of the novel, Goodbye Blue Monday, alludes to the practice of using African Americans as machines to complete the domestic chores around a household. And just as Descartes denied animals pain and suffering because they were mere machines, Vonnegut reminds us of our long history of doing the same. Goodbye Blue Monday references the ad for a washing machine and other appliances that would complete the, quote, nigger work that white people, including Vonnegut's own mother, thought was beneath them. Mark Twain's Hartford Circle was not immune. Vonnegut guesses that psychologically northern states felt cheated out of the spoils of war, which were the human slaves. In an online tour of the Mark Twain house in Hartford, assistant curator Mallory Howard informs viewers that the hand-carved bed Mark Twain imported from Venice, Italy, cost $200 or $4,000 by today's values. To place that in context, Howard compares the cost of the bed with the annual salary of butler George Griffin, who made $360 a year. What Mallory does not follow up with is how much that annual salary would translate in today's dollars, which is less than $8,000 per year. I don't know if I would call that a slave wage, but it explains why Twain was constantly looking for business opportunities that could provide finances to maintain his lifestyle. Speaking of finances, money, greed, and social status are other topics the two men often address. For example, Vonnegut begins his novel, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, with the statement, a sum of money is a leading character in this tale about people. In the novel, that sum of money is $87,472,033.61. Twain wrote a short story called The $3,000 Bequest, where the sum is not identified as a character, but the eponymous title beckons us to consider it so. Now, the stories themselves are not so similar. The bequest is about how money changes people, even when the money exists only in their minds, as it does for Sally Foster and his wife, Alec. When they are informed that a distant relative, Tilbury Foster, has promised to leave the couple $30,000 in his will upon his death. The couple imagine the sum increasing due to imaginary investments and accrued interest. Before contrasting Twain's story with God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, I would like to interject Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where Billy Pilgrim reads a Kilgore Trout novel called The Big Board. The Big Board is about an Earthling couple kidnapped by aliens and placed in a zoo on the planet Zircon 212. The novel is also about an imaginary amount of money that keeps the couple stimulated so that they keep the zoo visitors entertained. When the market goes up, they jump and cheer. When it drops, they sulk or tear out their hair. Here's a passage from Slaughterhouse-Five. And religion got mixed up in it too. The news ticker reminded them that the President of the United States had declared National Day of Prayer Week and that everybody should pray. The Earthlings had had a bad week on the market before that. They had lost a small fortune in olive oil futures. So they gave praying a whirl. It worked. Olive oil went up. The Fosters also play the market in bequest, bringing their 30,000 to 120 million per annum until the market collapses. At the story's end, they discover their benefactor died penniless and they were to receive no inheritance. God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater centers around a lawyer eager to take advantage of Elliot Rosewater's alleged insanity by transferring the Rosewater fortune to the next legal descendant and thus enriching himself through the transaction's legal fees. Incidentally, Lancelot also plays the stock market in Connecticut Yankee. Another incidental, almost trivial similarity can be found in the openings of Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Huck Finn begins with, "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. The book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth." Compare that with the casual start in Slaughterhouse-Five. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. In her book Comedic Pathos, The Black Humor in Mark Twain's Fiction, Patricia Mandria points out that, quote, "Black humorists sometimes make it difficult to discern the difference between dream and reality," end quote. And quoting Max Schultz in her book, Mandria writes, "Schultz insists that this stylistic element, the blurring of fact and fiction, is indicative of the unreliability of reality." Huck Finn implodes reality immediately in that a fictional character is referencing the author and making it clear the author embellished the telling of the fictional facts in a prior work, and the reader can assume he will do the same again in this one, if this even makes any sense. Vonnegut does a similar thing in Slaughterhouse-Five in that the speaker in chapter 1 is ostensibly Vonnegut, but I suggest the speaker is the character Kurt Vonnegut and not the author Kurt Vonnegut. This distinction further blurs the line between dream and reality and is made clear at the end of the chapter, where the experience of the character Vonnegut anticipates the experiences of the protagonist Billy Pilgrim in the novel. I referenced this passage earlier when discussing Shields' contention about Ambrose Bierce's influence. The time would not pass. Somebody was playing with the clocks, and not only with the electric clocks, but the wind-up kind too. The second hand on my watch would twitch once, and a year would pass, and then it would twitch again. There was nothing I could do about it. As an earthling, I had to believe whatever clocks said, and calendars. Later in the novel, Billy Pilgrim and the blue movie actress Montana Wildhack are in their geodesic dome on the planet Tralfamadore. Recall here the Kilgore Trout novel, The Big Board, when Montana observes, quote, "They're playing with the clocks again," unquote, referring to the Tralfamadorians manipulating the clocks in their zoo enclosure. Even the full title of Slaughterhouse-Five playfully suggests that the novel is not to be trusted. This is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic, schizophrenic manner of Tales on the Planet Tralfamadore, where the flying saucers come from. You see that at the bottom of this title page. What are we then to make of a reality we cannot rely on? What are we to do with a reality filled with suffering and death? Laugh or cry? Twain and Vonnegut understood too well the tragic nature of the human condition and the futile attempts to ameliorate suffering, and yet they kept producing to the very end. In some ways, their conclusions about determinism can work to deflect their own responsibility in the suffering and death of their loved ones, or it may even help them cope with survivor's guilt. While interesting, these psychoanalytic diagnoses lessen the power of their work. There are certain realities that all of us deny on a daily basis. The most important is our own mortality. Vonnegut addresses this when challenged by Harrison Starr in Slaughterhouse-Five, who tells Vonnegut when he learns Vonnegut is writing an anti-war novel, "Why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead?" To which Vonnegut comments, "Even if wars didn't keep coming like glaciers, there would still be plain old death. And the old lies are no longer enough to keep people going," as Elliot Rosewater tells his doctor in Slaughterhouse-Five. Vonnegut provides alternatives for the reader, Foma and Cat's Cradle, and he offers God the utterly indifferent in Sirens of Titan. Eschewing the idea that this is nihilism in Vonnegut, Jerome Klinkowitz argues that Vonnegut is drawing on his anthropologist disposition to demonstrate how truth is self-invented, meaning fabricated, not by superior authorities, but by people within their own cultural context according to their specific needs. In the 1973 Playboy interview, Vonnegut voices his disappointment with religion, not because it lies, but because it does not lie well enough, especially in its attempts to promote honesty and brotherhood. In the interview, Vonnegut describes his pragmatic role as a writer, calling what he does horseshit, a useful, comforting sort of horseshit. Vonnegut concludes that everything is a lie because our brains are 2-bit computers and we can't get very high-grade truth out of them. But as far as improving the human condition goes, our minds are certainly up to that. That's what they're designed to do. This idea is reminiscent of Satan in The Mysterious Stranger, who tells Theodore that, quote, nothing exists, all is a dream, God, man, the world, they have no existence. But I, your poor servant, have revealed you to yourself and set you free. Dream other dreams and better. For two old, suicidal, pessimistic determinists, they do sound pretty hopeful. Vonnegut makes use of the phrase, so it goes, repeatedly in Slaughterhouse-Five to mark every time someone or something dies, including a glass of water. He and Twain both use and so on regularly. I could end with the same sentiment and so on, as there are countless more examples I could offer, but I hope the ones I have included suffice to establish the affinity between Twain and Vonnegut. But I will end with one final example before concluding. In the 1979 address at the Twain House, Vonnegut quotes from the climax of A Connecticut Yankee, setting it up thusly. I quote, and I invite you to chuckle along with me as I read. Now, there's nothing inherently funny about the passage, of course. The 13 Gatlings began to vomit death into the fated 10,000. They halted, they stood their ground a moment against the withering deluge of fire, and then they broke, faced about, and swept toward a ditch like chaff before a gale. A full fourth part of their force never reached the lofty embankment. These 3/4 reached it and plunged over to death by drowning. Within 10 short minutes after we had opened fire, armed resistance was totally annihilated. The campaign was ended. We 54 were masters of England. 25,000 men lay dead around us. Now compare that with what Kilgore Trout whispered as he lay dying in Timequake. His very first story he told me as he was dying was set in Camelot, the court of King Arthur of Britain. Merlin, the court magician, casts a spell that allows him to equip the Knights of the Round Table with Thompson submachine guns and drums of 45 caliber dum-dums. Sir Galahad, the purest in heart and mind, familiarized himself with this new virtue-compelling appliance. While doing so, he puts a slug through the Holy Grail and makes the Swiss cheese of Queen Guinevere. Can anyone argue that Twain's story did not suggest Vonnegut's? Further, both Arthurian stories arrive at the same conclusion, which is good intentions combined with power are destructive. Why should this be so? Because as we have noted, human nature itself can be influenced by outside forces in positive or negative ways. Hank Morgan is arrogant and his power goes unchecked in his attempts to impose 19th century ideas about the economy, about politics, about culture on an unsuspecting 6th century population, and he's prepared to use superior technology to achieve those ends, presumably for their own benefit. Trout's selection of the knight Sir Galahad strikes at the core of man's proclivity for corruption, and the story's ironic understatement that describes the submachine gun as a virtue-compelling appliance is too perfect in its humor. Returning to the 1979 address at the Twain House, Vonnegut said about A Connecticut Yankee, quote, "The fatal premise of A Connecticut Yankee remains a chief premise of Western civilization, and increasingly of world civilization, to wit, the sanest, most likable persons employing superior technology will enforce sanity throughout the world." This comment seems to describe his own short tale as well as it does Twain's long novel. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at coronado@southtexascollege.edu. Have a great day.